Good morning. I'm Cindy Jackson, co-chair of the Grandmothers Against Violence Foundation and moderator of today's program, Research to Action, Solutions to Gun Violence. First, I need special thanks to Sarah Dean and Amber Twilo, our program assistants, for the poignant video preceding the program. I also wish to recognize Vlad Brackburn with the Alliance for Gun Responsibility for providing us exceptional technical assistance. But a few housekeeping details before we get started with our program. If you haven't already done so, we suggest you select Speaker View in the upper right-hand corner of the Zoom window. There will be 10 minutes for questions after each presentation. And if you have a question, and I'm sure you will, please drop the questions in the Q&A box that you can find in the Zoom window. The chat function will be disabled for today's program, so we can focus on our questions. This event will be recorded and available with requests through our website after the event. Now, to begin, the mission of our foundation is to work to end gun violence in our communities by raising funds for research that informs public health and safety policies. Since our founding in 2018, the foundation has funded 6 research projects. We support research that can lead to solutions and clarify policy approaches. For example, a supported survey of gun owners provided insight into gun storage practices in Washington, and it inspired the Seattle City Council to develop the Seattle's Responsible Storage Law that took effect in 2019. The research findings being shared today will enrich our level of awareness and have the potential to influence community action as it has in the past. Our first study to be presented today is Firearm Threats and Violence Against Children and Youth in Domestic Violence Protection Orders in King County, Washington. Dr. Ellyson and Dr. Rowhani-Rahbar of University of Washington collaborated for this study. Dr. Ellyson is assistant professor in pediatrics at the University of Washington School of Medicine and affiliated researcher with the Harborview Injury Prevention and Research Center. Dr. Rowhani-Rahbar is a nationally known scholar and professor of epidemiology in University of Washington School of Public Health and has affiliate appointments in pediatrics and Evans School of Public Policy and Governance. And now I welcome Dr. Ellyson and Dr. Rowhani-Rahbar for their presentation.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Cindy. Brad is sharing the screen. There we go. That's perfect. Thank you. We are very excited to share both our findings as well as some important policy and practical implications for gun violence prevention from our funded research project, Firearm-Related Threats and Violence Against Minors, documented in Domestic Violence Protection Orders in King County. Before we begin, I just want to take this opportunity to thank you all of you for your investment of time, energy, and resources to the Grandmothers Against Gun Violence Foundation. This project and our findings would not have been possible without your generous support of research and the timeless and continuing effort that you provide in this area. I'd also like to recognize some key community and research partners who've also contributed to our project. Community partners at the RDV FEU, as well as others listed here. In particular, I want to note the dedication and commitment of our research staff. Without them and their tenacious effort on this project, the findings and data that I present today would not exist. We know that intimate partner violence and domestic violence are a key contributor to gun violence broadly. Intimate partner violence, or IPV, describes physical, sexual, or psychological harm by a current or former partner or spouse. Domestic violence, or DV, includes IPV, as well as other forms of violence in the home against children, parents, or the elderly. Both IPV and DV are consistently linked in prior research to gun violence. Over half of female victims of intimate partner homicide in the US are killed with a gun. Nearly 2/3 of child fatalities occurring in the setting of IPV are a consequence of using guns. And IPV and DV are also linked to mass shootings. Nearly 3 in 4 children and teens that are killed in mass shootings are killed in a shooting that has been linked to IPV or DV. And a large proportion of mass shootings are either DV related or perpetrated by someone with a DV history. A domestic violence protection order is one public health and public safety intervention, a legal order where a person, the petitioner, files against another person, the respondent, when they have been a victim survivor of DV by the respondent. A DVPO can provide a series of protections, like excluding the respondent from a shared residence, prohibiting the respondent from committing acts of DV or harassing or contacting the petitioner, establishing temporary custody and visitation for minors who are involved, and ordering the respondent to participate in treatment or counseling. Federal law prohibits individuals from purchasing or possessing firearms when they are subject to a DVPO. And importantly, in Washington state, a court can also order a respondent who's subject to a DVPO to surrender firearms and other dangerous weapons. In terms of research, little is known about how firearms are involved in threats and violent acts against minors in the setting of IPV or DV, or how DVPOs can help reduce both firearm and non-firearm related harm to minors who are involved. To address this limitation, we proposed 2 study aims that were generously funded by the foundation, both in the context of DVPOs, to better understand firearm and non-firearm related harm to minors involved. The first was to measure the frequency and characteristics of the use of firearms in both threats and acts of violence against children and youth in granted DVPOs. The second was to examine subsequent violence after a granted DVPO and an order to surrender firearms and other dangerous weapons. We obtained a 55% random sample of all granted DVPOs in King County between 2014 and 2020. We abstracted data from these granted DVPOs and excluded 36 cases because the files were not available or could not be read, which was less than 1% of the random sample. 1,458 cases because they did not involve minors, a little less than 41% of the random sample, and 55 cases because minors involved were experiencing or using adolescent dating violence as opposed to living in a home where their parents or guardians or other family members were experiencing IPV or DV. That was less than 1.5% of the random sample. So our final study sample included 2,030 granted DVPOs that involved minors, which was about 57% of the full random sample. First, we measured the frequency and characteristics of the use of firearms in threats and acts of violence against children and youth in granted DVPOs. As you can see here, almost 1 in 3 cases involving minors, or 32.5%, included explicit threats against children or youth, and there were acts of violence in almost half of the DVPO cases involving minors, exactly 48.9% of cases. Overall, there were 1,338 cases where at least one minor experienced some sort of threat or act of violence perpetrated by the DVPO respondent. Because many cases involve more than one minor, this means that threats or acts of violence were committed by respondents against a minor in the homes of up to 2,484 minors in King County alone over the 6 years of our study period. This is really a minimum number of children and youth in King County only who are impacted by DV-related threats and acts of violence, since IPV and DV survivors often do not file for a DVPO. We also wanted to understand the kinds of threats and acts of violence that perpetrators used. The figure on the left shows the most common types of threats. When threats were used against minors, the most common was custodial, threatening to kidnap or separate a minor from the petitioner who is a parent or guardian. And this type of threat was used in about 40% of cases with threats against minors, or 317 cases total. The next two most common types of threats were physical abuse, like threatening to assault or inflict bodily harm or cause substantial pain or harm to the minor in 165 cases, and homicide, threatening to kill or cause the death of a minor in 161 cases. Both of these types of threats were used in about 20% of cases with threats. The figure on the right depicts the most common types of violence that were used against minors involved. The most common form of violence was physical abuse, which occurred in about 42% of cases with violence, or 592 cases overall. Endangerment in about 15% of cases with violence, or 205 cases overall. The remaining categories of types of violence, like neglect, custodial, harassment, coercion, and sexual abuse, occurred in between 6 to 10% of cases with acts of violence against minors. And starkly, unfortunately, there was also one homicide of a minor involved in one DVPO case. These percentages might add to more than 100 because more than one type of threat or violence could be used. And all of these threats and acts of violence were directed specifically at the minors involved and not other family members. These data really show that both threats and acts of violence against minors involved are quite common, pose a substantial harm to minors, and can be quite severe. Our team recorded all weapons involved in these threats and acts of violence. When threats were used against minors, 28.6% of these threats involved some kind of weapon. That was in 189 cases. On the other hand, when acts of violence were used, 68.6% of cases involved some kind of weapon, or 682 cases total. The rate of the use of weapons in violence against minors involved is far higher than the use of weapons generally among DVPO cases that involve minors, which is only about 38%. While most threats did not involve weapons, about 4.4% of cases with threats, or 29 cases, involved a gun. These can be quite scary and traumatic and harmful to minors involved because of the severity and lethality of the use of a gun in threats. On the other hand, almost 2/3 of cases with acts of violence against minors involved some kind of weapon. A small proportion, about 1.3%, or 13 cases, involved the use of a gun. Again, even though these are small numbers, the use of a gun in both threats and acts of violence in IPV and DV can be quite traumatic, harmful, and severe. And so while this is a small proportion of cases overall, for public health and public safety, it's still quite an important experience for these individuals. This use of guns against minors involved in both threats and acts of violence is less common than the use of guns generally in DV. About 17% of granted DVPO cases involving minors included some sort of firearm-related threats or acts of violence. But most often, these threats and violence were directed at the petitioners and not the minors involved. However, the proportion of firearm-related threats and violence against minors were higher among firearm possessing respondents when a firearm was in the home. You can also see that when a weapon was used, the split between cases where only a bodily weapon was used and cases where a non-gun external weapon, like a knife, a bat, or another object was used is about even. In cases with threats, about 12% involved only a bodily weapon, and about 13% involved a non-gun external weapon. In cases with violence, about 37% involved a bodily weapon only, and about 31% involved a non-gun external weapon. Threats and acts of violence against minors were common in our study of granted DVPOs. There were threats against minors in about 1 in 3 DVPO cases, and acts of violence against minors in about 1 in 2 cases. The use of weapons in these threats and acts of violence was also common, particularly when violence was used. Overall, our findings show that there were 1,338 cases where at least one minor experienced some sort of threat or act of violence perpetrated by the DVPO respondent. And as I mentioned, because many of these cases involve more than one minor, this means threats or acts of violence were committed by respondents against a minor in the homes of at least 2,484 minors in King County over the 6 years of our study. This suggests that even if minors are not the direct recipient of these threats or violence involving weapons and firearms, they may still suffer substantial harm from being exposed to this form of violence at home. Well-implemented restrictions on weapons and firearms, like federal prohibitions on firearms for DVPO respondents and the processes and procedures of the RDVFEU, are a vital part of protecting the safety and well-being of both petitioners and minors involved. The RDVFEU, or the Regional Domestic Violence Firearms Enforcement Unit, is one of the first of its kind in the nation. The combination of its innovative and multidisciplinary approach and our ongoing research on its effectiveness will help inform policy recommendations for the rest of the country. Our collaborative relationship with partners at the RDVFEU also gives us the opportunity to provide them with this information and work with them to assess relevant risk factors that might assist them in safety planning for the families that they encounter. Because these firearm-related protections are so important, in 2014, Washington State enacted a law that strengthened federal prohibitions on firearm purchasing and possession for respondents. In 2018, our partner, the RDVFEU, was created to help implement, enforce, and promote compliance with these prohibitions. The RDVFEU is a multidisciplinary and interjurisdictional unit that responds to the immense challenge of firearms in both civil and criminal cases by coordinating across offices in the legal system to promote respondent compliance with orders to surrender firearms and other dangerous weapons. An order to surrender is an explicit order as part of a DVPO, where a respondent is ordered to surrender dangerous weapons, firearms, as well as concealed carry licenses to the court, for example, to a law enforcement agency. The RDVFEU prioritizes the DVPO cases with the highest risk of potential harm based on their assessment of the danger posed to either the petitioner or the minors involved. The presence of a firearm is a key component of the risk and danger assessment for families. Importantly, the strengthening and enforcement of these federal prohibitions on those subject to protection orders, like the one that passed here in Washington, was one of the most common gun legislative initiatives that passed across the United States in the decades since the Sandy Hook shooting, despite there being little action on other measures. This figure shows both judicial adherence to the new Washington law after its enactment in 2014, as well as changes in documented compliance during our study period after the implementation of the RDVFEU in 2018. In terms of judicial practice after the law's passage in 2014, the proportion of cases with an explicit order to surrender weapons grew quite rapidly. In 2014, only 21.6% of granted DVPOs had an order to surrender weapons and firearms. But by 2020, just over 80% of granted DVPOs explicitly included an order to surrender weapons and firearms. However, the practical implementation of promoting compliance among DVPO respondents by the RDVFEU has been vital. In 2014, you can see here by the light yellow shaded bar, there was almost no documented compliance provided by respondents who were subject to an order to surrender weapons. Documented compliance grew in 2015 and 2016, the darker gold shaded bars, but there was no verification that the documentation provided was accurate, and the courts didn't conduct any sort of compliance review except for scheduling a compliance calendar hearing, which many respondents didn't attend. However, between 2018 and 2020, over 60% of cases with an order to surrender weapons contained documented compliance from respondents that was reviewed and vetted for accuracy by the RDVFEU. The RDVFEU found evidence that the respondent may have access to, possess, or own firearms in about 1 in 5 cases, when respondents do not voluntarily surrender weapons and firearms. Importantly, the RDV-FEU detected 135 respondents who owned, possessed, or had access to firearms where the petitioner did not think or did not know that the respondent had that kind of access. This is vitally important for petitioner safety planning and family safety planning, because often there's no way for a petitioner to check on their own whether the respondent has tried to purchase a gun or has access to a gun through a friend or family member. Overall, from 2018 to 2020, an average of 2.5 firearms were surrendered in each case, with a range from 0 to 22 firearms. An average of 0.38 other weapons, like hunting or combat knives, were surrendered, with a range from 0 to 31 other dangerous weapons. To understand the role of orders to surrender weapons and firearm removal on subsequent violent crime committed by respondents, we obtained data from the Washington State Patrol and linked our case data to arrest records of DVPO respondents. There were 705 respondents with a subsequent arrest for any violent crime after a DVPO was granted. 522 of these arrests for subsequent violent crimes were within 2 years of the granted DVPO. Many of these subsequent arrests for violent crime may involve minor victims, but Washington State revised codes rarely specify whether violent crime is perpetrated against a minor victim, and the age of the victim is not recorded in the WSP records that we are able to access. There were 18 respondents who were arrested for a subsequent violent crime where Washington State statute explicitly specifies the crime had a minor victim. This is likely a severe underestimate of the extent of subsequent violent crime against children and youth committed by DVPO respondents, especially considering that 50% of petitions for DVPOs described acts of violence against the minors involved. Unfortunately, in Washington State, the only way to identify whether or not these crimes involved a minor victim would be to review all 705 court cases and/or police records for these subsequent violent crimes across the state. While it's difficult to detect subsequent violent crimes against children and youth using Washington State revised codes, about 1 in 5 respondents were arrested for a violent crime after a granted DVPO, and about 1 in 5 respondents were found to have access to firearms when they did not voluntarily surrender them. Because this suggests that more work is really needed, and particularly more attention to the use of firearms by former DVPO respondents in subsequent crime. Once a DVPO expires, often only after 1 year, a DVPO respondent is legally permitted to possess and own firearms as long as they don't have other disqualifying offenses. Because incarceration of a family member or a close adult, in addition to experiencing or witnessing violence at home, is an adverse childhood experience with adverse consequences to health and well-being, these findings also establish the scope of harm to children and youth as part of DV and IPV. Future work should seek to better understand how minors involved are negatively impacted by initial DV exposure, as well as these subsequent arrests among family members for violent crimes. As we move forward with our community partner, we will be working to share these findings and examine risk factors for both violence and subsequent crime among DVPO respondents to inform safety planning. In addition to the research that you support, there's more that you all can do too. IPV and DV impact almost 1 in 3 people in the US. So if you or someone you know is experiencing IPV or DV, the National Domestic Violence Hotline provides confidential support 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. They can be reached at the phone number listed here or by text or online at thehotline.org. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Ellyson. And I know we're going to have some questions now. We have one to get started with, and I'm sure now as people are beginning to think about and process that important information that you shared, especially about the trauma, that is befitting our children who are involved in these situations. So the first question that we have is from a attendee. In DVPO cases, is there any follow-up of victims, minors, to provide treatment for emotional impacts of exposure?
This is a wonderful and very important question. So there absolutely are, but it all hinges on whether or not a survivor and their family have access to advocates as well as the support system. So for example, if a survivor goes to a protection order advocacy office, they will often refer families to social services, to social workers, and to other programs that can assist them. The RDV FEU will do the same. So as they are reviewing cases, if there's evidence or if they're talking to the survivor and it becomes very clear that there's trauma involved to the minors, they will often refer those individuals to support services. But there are a lot of petitioners who don't know how to access or navigate the system, which means it's very, very easy for minors who have been traumatized to miss out on an opportunity to seek mental health care and be provided care for the trauma that they have experienced. Dr. Rowhani-Rahbar and I, this is a huge concern of ours and a thing that we talk about with our community partner constantly, because the access to those resources is very inequitably distributed. Both income, race, ethnicity, immigration status, and other factors can really limit the kinds of resources that a survivor has access to. And there are lots of gaps in the support systems. Dr. Rowhani, is there anything that you want to add?
No, I think you covered it really well. And I will just add to that, and this is a conversation I've had with Dr. Jennifer Stuber as well, who is joining us today. It's not just DVPOs. Across many types of protection orders, this issue exists that Dr. Ellyson mentioned. So for example, for red flag laws or extreme risk protection orders, whether it's for the respondents or petitioners, these issues such as self-harm, interpersonal violence come up all the time. So support services for those individuals who are involved and their families after the protection order has been granted or expires are really needed. Currently, they are not built into the system, but this is something that we really all need to work toward, because there are certain agencies and institutions that are involved in different parts of these processes across the spectrum. But at the end of the day, what matters the most, as Dr. Ellyson mentioned, is the safety and well-being of those who are directly at highest risk. So this clearly is it's an area for future work across not only DVPOs, but also all protection orders that we have in Washington State.
Thank you. And I think this question is somewhat related to that. What is the relationship of an ERPO and a DVPO?
That's a wonderful question, and things have changed over time. So the conditions by which you qualify for a DVPO or a domestic violence protection order are a little different than the conditions under which you qualify for an extreme risk protection order or an ERPO. However, in the last year or so, Washington State has worked to kind of streamline the process for all forms of protection orders. In both ERPOs and DVPOs, the order to surrender weapons can be included by the court. And so the removal of firearms can occur in both cases. But the conditions under which you qualify for them are a little different. For a DVPO, you have to have experienced DV by the respondent. That can include now, with the most recent changes, coercive control. As DV, you don't necessarily have to experience physical or sexual violence to qualify for that. With an ERPO, you need to establish that there's an extreme risk of harm either to the respondent themselves or to others. And so the conditions under which you qualify for these different kinds of protection orders are just a little different. Washington State also has anti-harassment protection orders, stalking protection orders, sexual harassment protection orders, vulnerable adult protection orders, which are all really important for us to know. And again, Washington State has really been working to streamline those processes, but there's a certain set of protection orders on which the firearm removal and order to surrender weapons and firearms comes into effect.
Next question. Can you comment on the boyfriend loophole and its importance?
Yes. So luckily in Washington State, the legislature has done a pretty good job of closing that boyfriend loophole. So you can file for a domestic violence protection order if you are a current or former intimate partner or spouse. In some states, you have to be legally married or defined by the state as being in a legal partnership to qualify for a domestic violence protection order. It's important because we know that relationships are fluid and that things change over time, and that sometimes, and particularly for some individuals, marriage has not always been an option and has not always been legal. So there are many people in many states who cannot be protected by domestic violence protection orders because their state does not allow them to legally marry, and then they are not protected by this because they don't meet that legal requirement for the DVPO. Luckily in Washington State, again, you can petition for a DVPO with a current or former intimate partner. It does not have to be a spouse. It can be a boyfriend. And you can also petition for this if you're experiencing adolescent dating violence. So you don't even have to be an adult. You can be in a dating relationship and petition for that as well. But not all states have closed that loophole.
But important information for us to be able to share with young people. Right?
Yes, absolutely.
Additional question. Did your findings suggest what new policies or support of existing policies would be most helpful?
Absolutely. So some of our ongoing research is really working on that subsequent violent crime to understand how the implementation of the RDV FEU might reduce subsequent violent crime. But as you can see from the data that we have analyzed, subsequent violent crime after DVPO is still really important, and access to firearms is still really important. So as I mentioned, once a DVPO expires, a respondent is legally permitted to possess and own firearms. And what we really don't know now is to what extent firearms are involved in those subsequent violent crimes. And so that's a really important area for future policy work, as well as really understanding the harm to minors who are involved. And as a previous question, whether or not those minors are getting treatment for the trauma that they've experienced, both the trauma from the initial DV exposure, but also the potential trauma from having a family member who is arrested or incarcerated. Dr. Rowhani, is there anything you'd want to add to that?
No, I think that was terrific. I would just say that in addition to, we talk about these all the time, in addition to enacting and implementing new laws, we should not forget that we already have laws that need to be implemented better. Let's not forget also about existing laws. Under federal law, individuals who are subject to domestic violence restraining orders, they should not possess firearm. However, some states, as you know, and Dr. Ellyson mentioned, have not implemented that well. In Washington, we have strengthened that state law to be consistent with that. So this has been on the books for a long time. But it's upon us to actually implement it. It's not a new law. We need to strengthen our state law to actually adhere to that. So we need both the implementation of existing laws and also thinking constantly about new laws and policies.
Perfect. We have one final question. How routine is the order to surrender firearms in DV cases? Do judges always require this, or can that step be missed?
That is also a great question. So in the period following the implementation of the RDVFEU, about 80% of DBPO cases included an order to surrender weapons. Legally, there are certain circumstances which make an order to surrender weapons mandatory. Our team has also evaluated that. So what proportion of cases include an order to surrender weapons when it's legally mandatory, as far as we can tell in the data, and what proportion of discretionary cases. About 90% or 95% of the cases in this 2018 to 2020 period after the RDVFEU was implemented have that order to surrender weapons when it's mandatory, but it is missed. And it's up to judges, advocates, the RDVFEU, and other legal attorneys in that courtroom to make sure that everyone is aware of what the legal requirements are and make sure it gets ordered when it's mandatory. The other challenge here is that sometimes when an order to surrender weapons is not explicit as part of that DVPO, a respondent might leave the courtroom thinking that they can own and possess firearms, when in fact it is still illegal according to federal law. And so we have really been talking with our community partner about communicating these findings to judges. They are still missing cases when it is mandatory according to law. And there are many cases where they're not ordering it, where it's discretionary according to Washington state law. But federally, all of these DVPO respondents are still prohibited. And it's really important when everyone leaves the courtroom that everyone involved, the respondent, the petitioner, everyone knows that. So that the petitioner knows what rights they have, what protections they have, and so that the respondent can legally comply and not run into additional legal trouble if they go to buy a firearm and they're prohibited and then they're charged for attempting to make that purchase when they're prohibited.
Oh my. Thank you so much. Sadly, this is the end of our time for questions. I think we have a few more people who are very interested, but I know that by following your current and your future research and staying on top of our knowledge of the laws and encouraging those folks that we know who are involved in domestic violence to engage in the process, that we will be able to serve. So thank you for increasing our understanding. Both you, Dr. Ellyson and Dr. Rowhani-Rahbar, appreciate your participation in helping us understand today. So ready to move on. We have our next presentation is called Asking is Caring, a community conversation and training about youth mental health and suicide prevention. Our presenters are Dr. Jennifer Stuber and Mr. Ted Robbins. Dr. Stuber is associate professor at the University of Washington School of Social Work and adjunct faculty with the School Mental Health Assessment, Research, and Training Center called SMART. Mr. Robbins is a husband, a father of 3 children living in Richland, Washington. In addition, he's the father of a child who committed suicide. He's the founding member and master trainer of the Asking is Caring organization and a passionate advocate for mental health and suicide prevention. I now bring to you and welcome Dr. Stuber and Mr. Roberts. Please remember to use the question and answer tab as you did before. We're getting some great questions, and I know that this presentation will encourage some also. Are we ready?
Good morning. How are you all? Thank you so much, Cindy, for that introduction. And we're really, really grateful to you for being so involved in our research project over this past year. We really want to thank all the grandmothers for the work that is coming before you. And I also just want to give a shout out to Alice and Ali for their work. You know, it's very often that sometimes that can happen, that epidemiologic data, large data sets like the ones they're working with, while incredibly useful, don't get directly applied to kind of policy and implications. And the strength of your community partner and your hard work to build that relationship is truly to be applauded. So thank you so much for that. So we're going to talk about a project that, with your support, we implemented last year in the school districts of Richland and Walla Walla. You could go to the next slide. I'm just going to do a slide summary of what we did. And then I'm actually going to do something a little bit different today, because you've heard a lot of great research this morning, but we really wanted to give you a feel for kind of the work that we're doing in these Eastern Washington communities. So you can kind of walk away with like a really tangible idea about how this impacts, firearm related issues, which we know you're the most concerned with. So I used to be I was the founder and the director of Forefront Suicide Prevention for a decade. And then I transitioned at the UW over to the SMART Center. And the reason I did that was I really wanted to focus on school-based approaches to mental health and suicide prevention that are really kind of tied into school districts. And the UW SMART Center has a lot of influence and provides a lot of support to school districts in Eastern Washington. And so what we did last year with your support is we developed a curriculum called Asking is Caring. And this curriculum is somewhat about suicide prevention. And it's what makes it unique in that regard is that we are adding information about firearms safety and some of the tools that are available, such as the ERPO that we just discussed, to families when firearms are in the home and could be a risk to oneself or to other family members. So we developed this curriculum with those components, which is somewhat unique, although not entirely unique to the field of suicide prevention and training. But what we really wanted to do was to develop a training that was much more upstream, in the sense that we want to give parents practical steps, information that they can share and implement every day to like kind of keep their kids safe from mental health and suicide prevention challenges that may come about, but really give them tools that they can use immediately. The other key difference about the training that you're going to hear about, and you'll see evidence of this when my co-presenter Ted presents, is that we really value lived experience. So all of our trainers are people who care deeply about these issues, and oftentimes trainings will be very, we'll really kind of try to put those experiences aside and not actually deal with them directly. And I think that sometimes can lose some of the power. So we've really carefully worked with our people in this curriculum to make sure lived experience is a core part of what's shared. And that includes in relationship to people's experiences with owning medications, firearms, and other things that can be used that could be a barrier for youth mental health in the house. So we developed the curriculum, and then we recruited 6 parent caregivers in the 2 school districts, again, Walla Walla and Richland, to deliver the curriculum. And again, as I said, the parent caregivers weave in their own lived experience. They share their current storage practices for medications and firearms. And these 6 trainers had the opportunity, after extensive training, we put them through a 40-hour training for trainers, which Cindy and a couple of other of you were a part of, at least part of it. And they really, really blossomed through that 40 hours and really were able to pull off some really compelling community presentations of this material 6 times last spring. And we put in place a pretty solid data evaluation, future research strategy around having every participant who attends the training complete a pre-test, a post-test, and then a 4-week follow-up survey. So this isn't a randomized controlled trial or anything like that, but we definitely have really solid data that we're going to be collecting, as we do this work. Move on to the next slide. So what happened? So we had those 6 trainings. They were extremely well received in both school districts. One of the school districts, Richland, frankly hit it out of the park. Like, they had so much demand for the training because the school district did such a great job of coming alongside the trainers. And this kind of goes to that issue of, that district level buy-in is so important to any successful initiatives. Trying to partner community and school district together is just really critical. And so I'll just tell you a little bit about who was in the room that we were training. Half of the participants indicated that they knew a youth that they thought was at risk for suicide. And a kind of a big piece of what we talk about in the training is at the outset is that we all know somebody is at risk. So in fact, this number probably should have been higher in that sense, because we really go through the fact that, the risk across the lifespan, everybody really is at risk in some ways because of the range of experiences that can increase risk. But this was, the question was worded in a way that it was like, right now, do you feel that way? So that was pretty interesting to hear that half of our participants were really there because they were concerned about someone presently. And as we predicted, pretty high levels of medications and firearms ownership, likely an underreport, as most surveys will underreport these kinds of things because there's a social desirability effect happening. And participants universally who completed the pre-post training surveys had high levels of satisfaction and appreciation. And I think one of the most heartening aspects of the data that we collected was just how credible the parents were perceived. And I go back again to this notion of, let's not like keep lived experience to the side. Let's put it front and center so that people understand when participants understand when they're hearing from people that the stories that our trainers have gone through and how that gives them a ton of credibility. And so we also found that, pre and post test, very significant differences, although we can't, it's small numbers at this stage. We anticipate in the next year, everything was going in the right direction, where like the training was not only well received, but really we're starting to see changes in behavior, such as, are you locking firearms? 4 weeks later, we're not showing those numbers, very small at this point because the 4-week follow-up, of course, drops off from some of the other numbers, but we're seeing everything going in the right direction. So we feel like we have a really solid curriculum and set of trainers who are in place. Next slide. So this is the curriculum, and I'm going to turn it over to my colleague in 1 second, my dear colleague, Ted Robinson. But the curriculum, just so you know, covers these areas. It talks about how do you look for signs of distress. And again, like this idea that this lens that we all need to kind of be flipping open, which says, look, there's a lot of us who are struggling out there, and we need to just be thinking about that and looking for ways to connect with people and looking for their distress so that we can be more supportive. So the curriculum talks about that. It talks about how do you engage with your kid on a day-to-day basis with empathy and acceptance, because we think that that's a really key piece to intervening especially when there's a crisis. We talk about suicide specifically and what you can really do to kind of mitigate suicide in the household if that becomes an issue for you. And then we talk about connection. This last part of the curriculum really reinforces protective factors around suicide. Again, not just for suicide, but all the time around mental health challenges for youth. And we talk a lot about the resources, including some of the new resources that are available, such as 988. And so what I thought we would do today is Ted, who's one of our parent trainers and has been an incredible leader in this work and in this space, he was going to just share a very small part of the curriculum that we present in these communities, and just to give you a flavor of what it's like and how it's being presented. So I'm going to turn it over to Ted right now, and he'll walk you through. And so it'll feel a little bit odd where he's coming into it. Just know that there's a lot of additional material you're not seeing, but we really wanted Ted to present the part of the curriculum in particular where we talk about storage of medications and firearms. Go ahead, Ted.
Hi, everyone. Can we go to the next slide, please? Hi, everyone. My name's Ted Robbins, and I'm a parent trainer for Asking is Caring. Before I get started, I'd like to tell you that this section of Care 2 is just extremely important and personal to myself. The reason why it's so important and personal is 2.5 years ago, my oldest son, Christian, at the age of 16 years old, died by suicide with my firearm. So I want to thank everyone for allowing me to come on and really give this section of this presentation because I feel it's extremely important. The section we're going to give the training on today is called Care 2. Care 2 that we have is really talking about practical steps. And when we talk about practical steps, these are not just steps that can you use in your home, but these can be used in the entire community to not only make yourself and your family safer, but being able to make it safer for friends that are coming over to the house. This step of Care 2 is also really important because of the easy access to lethal means in your home increases your household risk for suicide. Also, youth acts of suicide tend to be more impulsive. Next slide, please. So oftentimes, I know as a parent, you will go to your youth that you have. They're going outside, we're going somewhere, and we talk about protection. We talk about wearing your seatbelts in the car. We talk about wearing helmets when you ride a bike. We tell them about limiting screen time. And what we're trying to do during these Asking is Caring presentations is we're trying to get people to talk more about suicide, like we do about seatbelts and helmets, and making it not feel awkward, and how do we talk. So we feel it's just real important to try to implement this into the families. Did you know that over 50% of youth suicides ages 10 to 18 involve a firearm or medications? Girls are more likely to attempt suicide than boys. Medication overdose is the most common method used by girls. Boys are almost 3 times more likely to die by suicide than girls, with firearms being the most common method used for boys. And then in youth suicides that involve a firearm, 82% use a family member's firearm. Now, during these presentations, we try to stress that this is not an anti-gun message. Guns and medication do not cause suicide. But what they do is offer a lethal means of high risk for suicide that we have. And again, in Christian's case, my oldest son, it was all about risk for him. And there was no way for us to be able to save him at that time because of the use of the firearm. So again, we try to stress and look at these statistics. And when you look at the one where it talks about the firearms, that's the reason why there was really no chance to save Christian, because he did use my firearm. Let's talk next about practical steps for medication storage and disposal. You'll see over here on the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see the little pill box or the lock box for prescriptions or over-the-counter medication. It doesn't have to be even as fancy as this. It can be a box that you go to Lowe's or Home Depot to lock up medication, or a cabinet as long as it has a lock on it. But these days of being able to go down to Costco and leave a giant-sized bottle of Costco Tylenol in your house, those days should change. You can use these pill organizers. We have another picture here to the left-hand side of a pill organizer that we have. And if we're able to store our medication in a locked area, and then being able to use these pill organizers that we have, it can be very helpful. Also, if you're not using medication that you have anymore, there's also a lot of take-back sites that you can take your medication to. We stress in our area, there's individual boxes like at Walmart, Walgreens, stores that are like that have near the pharmacy, they have a box where you can take your medication to if you're no longer using them, and to be able to drop them off and keep your family safer. And then we like to closely supervise children in the use of medications. And the reason why we do that is that you might have done a really good job of being able to lock up your medication, being able to put it in the pill organizers. But what we're trying to stress is if you need to also closely supervise the children, because they might be taking the medication out and then stockpiling them for a future planned suicide. Now let's talk about practical steps for firearm storage. Store all firearms using a safe or other locking devices. There's lots of locking devices that you have individual trigger locks or safe. The safest practice is to lock firearms and ammo separately. And what I'd like to do for just a second is let's concentrate on what I just said. I said safest practice is to lock firearms and ammo separately. The reason why I'm stressing that is that as a parent, I grew up with the gun rack in the back of the car. My family had guns within the household. Myself, I bought our firearm for protection to protect my family. I had the ammunition and the firearm separate, and I had them hidden. I had them so hidden that I thought that no one would be able to connect the dots ever to be able to find the ammunition and the firearm. But I didn't have them locked up properly. Christian, my oldest son, he was extremely smart, and it took him a while to connect those dots but he was able to find them because I was not storing them properly. People have said that, I'm using it to protect my family. You see the picture on the left-hand side here. There's a biometrics, a quick acting. And if you look at my thumb as an example, I don't think there's any thumb in the world that's exactly like my pickle finger that I have here in order to open this biometric device. But there are ways to safely have access to the firearms by still locking them up properly. And then not allowing children unauthorized or unsupervised access to firearms. This is really important. And we talk about safety and we talk about risk within your home that you have, but your children might have been trained on firearms. They might understand how they work, but how about their friends that are coming over to the house? So really, when we're talking about safety and we're talking about risk, we're talking about not only making your home safer for your children or people that you're caregiving for, but also for friends that are coming over the house and truly making it safer for them. Options for removal of firearms. During a suicide crisis, you can ask a relative or close friend to temporarily remove firearms from the home. You can also go to your local law enforcement, gun dealer, or store to temporarily store your firearms. Or we can go to the courts to help with the removal of the guns in the home. And again, by being able to remove the firearms from the home, again, we're talking about risk, and we talk about risk a lot. When someone is in crisis, sometimes the best methodology is just to remove the firearms entirely. So one of these options we believe will work for families, especially in crisis. Practical steps to prevent suicide. When we're talking about suicide, we've talked about firearms, over-the-counter medication, or prescription medication. We talk about always locking those up. So we're talking about always keeping those locked up, but there's other things that if someone is in crisis that you have, there are other things that you can do to make your home safer. There's other things that are like this that you can go home if you have someone in crisis and make your home safer today. Tonight, you can go home. If someone is in crisis, you can look for belts, ropes, plastic bags and wrap, chemicals, poisons, alcohol, sharp objects, and keys. And by also trying to closely monitor their internet use, these are things that you can do when you have a youth today that is in crisis. I look back at Christian, and it was all about trying to buy time. We were trying to get the right treatment for Christian. Nothing was working. And he drove in the middle of the night on a early Sunday morning. He was 16 years old and he could drive, but he used my car keys. He used our car keys to drive to another state to take his life with my firearm. And if I had looked at that, and if I hadn't had the car keys so accessible on the counter, if I had to have them closer to me, it would have taken away one option for him and bought us more time. Myth and reality. We have a lot of these myth and reality slides throughout our presentation that we have for 2 hours for these community parents and caregivers. And let's go through the myth. If someone really wants to kill themselves, they will find a way. If they cannot access a firearm, they will just choose another method. The reality of that is that suicide crisis rise and fall. Many people in suicide crisis fixate on one method. If someone in crisis and cannot physically access a firearm or their method, this can lead to a chance for help. So just what I was talking about with Christian, if we were able to eliminate one of those options that we'd have for him, it would buy us more time. And again, more time. There's no magic wand I found as a parent for dealing with mental health. Sometimes you have to use different methods to try to help a child that is suffering from mental health. So this is going to just really allow us to buy more time. Collaboration. This is collaboration 3 because this is the third collaboration during our presentation for these parents and caregivers. And what's really cool is that we take these parents, and once they come in, we're trying to create a community environment. And creating this community environment, we're trying to help parents and caregivers feel like they're not alone. I know that I felt alone at that time when Christian took his life, and being able to be in a group, in a room with people that understand or maybe going through the same thing that you're going through. And again, making them feel like they're not alone is important. So we have these 3 collaboration sections that everyone that is in the room, we give them workbooks. And so they go to their section of their workbook, and they have these individual questions that themselves and a partner that is in the room will go through, and they'll ask their partner all of these individual questions and write it in their workbook. Like, how do you store medications at your home if you have them? How do you store firearms at your home if you own them? What are some practical steps you can take to improve medication and firearm storage in your home? So sometimes during these collaborations, just really important is it tries to get the people that are involved in the overall training the ability to open up, to make some of these questions not so scary. Earlier in the presentation, we have ways of being able to understand, as Dr. Stuber had mentioned, of being able to talk to youth. So we believe that these collaborations not only allow the person to think more about it, but it also starts to get this bond with other people in the room, and it creates questions, and people start raising their hand, and they start feeling more comfortable as we start going through each one of these collaborations. So we just feel it's extremely important to get that interaction. Next steps that we have, parent and caregivers are forming a new nonprofit to assist them in further dissemination of the curriculum and expanding their school and community partnerships. The new nonprofit will launch in 2023. They plan to continue their partnership with the University of Washington related to implementation of training best practices, research, and evaluation. It's going to launch under a name called Connection Effect. And we're just real excited with that and moving this forward. In closing here, I would like to, again, thank everyone for allowing us to present Asking is Caring today. But I'd also like to leave you with my personal feeling that if I had been given this presentation that you're all able to review today, even just this one section, and the entire, all 5 sections would last about 2 hours. But if I was given this one portion of the section of the training while Christian was still here, it would have bought me more time. I would have left that community presentation. I would have went home and thought, oh, I need to secure my firearms differently. I need to secure my medication differently. It would have bought me more time, and my son Christian still might be here. So thank you. We'll open it up for questions now for Dr. Stuber and myself.
Cindy, you're on mute.
Jen, ready to go. Okay, you're on mute too now. So I've got a few questions that we would like to address. First event is I work in a school where there are 2 suicides. Do you do any work with school staff about dealing with the impact at the school site?
I personally do that work, but I do it with the Smart Center. And the reason I'm partnering with the Smart Center is I really want to build efforts that I believe can be sustainable. And I think it's really important for schools to not deal with issues kind of one at a time, like postvention here, training teachers here, training school counselors here. Like it has to be part of an integrated approach. And I think that the issue that you're talking about is a really sad and unfortunate one. And I would actually probably, if the school's not kind of looking at holistically improving their system, I would probably refer that school to really working more with Forefront on that, because there's a really important things you need to do in the aftermath of suicide. It's critically important because it can increase risk for other students when you don't do those things well. And But I think that it's really important also for school districts to think about this in a more holistic way than just kind of like focusing on it after a tragedy occurs, if that makes sense. So there's the UW Forefront is an organization that provides a lot of resources to schools in situations like that. Also, the educational service districts are another resource that school districts can turn to as well.
Thank you. So this is a curious question and related, I think, very closely with many of us see. In today's world, there seems to be a little bit more bullying and harassment, especially on computer, which adds another variable in understanding and supporting our children from risk. You have any thoughts about that?
Oh, for sure. The fact that suicide rates have continually increased. Most experts, it's very hard to prove, because there's so many different factors that are at play simultaneously and no controlled study. But everyone believes that the children's use of internet, social media, it plays a huge role in the increasing suicide rates, bullying that results, cyberbullying that results of that, shame and humiliation that can be generated by those experiences, magnified. And so 100-fold sometimes on the internet and social media. And so huge factor, very important. And our training here, this training touches on that in only the slightest way. And part of the reason why we really want to build this collaboration between parents and caregivers and school districts, and it's working in Richland, which is one of the places where we started up this work, is to really inform the education that goes on after they see something like Asking is Caring. And so Ted and Tasha and the trainers in Richland will be bringing in additional education this school year on that specific topic as well. They're consulting with the school district, which is just huge. Like the school district is actually open to hearing from parents. And this is a school district that, had 6 suicide deaths in 2 years, like since COVID started. And so it's just a huge, huge transformation that's happening. And honestly, it wouldn't have happened had it not been for you all, truly.
Thank you. Another question. The partners who collaborate during the training, are they spouses or others? And how do you deal with single parents?
Well, the people who participate in the training, we have good data that suggests that, right now it's a lot of people who are more likely to be married, although we do have people who are single parents who are coming to the training. I think one of the things that we really want to focus on this year is trying to reach some of the groups that may not be reached as well from disseminating training in this manner. Such as we're going to be doing some translating of the curriculum into some of the most common languages in the district, and trying to target parents who aren't there, and looking at the data in the school districts around who are the youth who are most at risk and how can we do more proactive outreach to them, and as well as finding trainers in our community, in those communities that really match those participants who aren't in the room. So we need to start paying attention to who's not in the room in addition to who is in the room.
Ted, we had a comment from a viewer here today who wanted to thank you for your candid and aspiring presentation, and kudos to the work that you have done over the time. That it's very important that your work and your feelings and your living history be shared. They just want to let you know they acknowledge that.
Well, thank you for that. But what's really neat during these presentations is it's not about, and as a community talking to parent isn't also just about, hey, if you don't do this you're going to have a suicide. We also have a lot of hope. My other parent trainers that are with me in the room who are giving this presentation is also a presentation of hope. That if you do make decisions and you do act, you are able to save your child. So we have hope stories that we have, and other trainers that necessarily haven't lost someone by suicide, but being able to give stories of hope. So thank you for that comment. But we're just on a mission to try to save families, because I, again, feel at my heart that we're saving families, we're saving kids, and we're making our community safer. And it's with only the help of this organization that we're able to make this possible. So thank you.
Well, thank you. So one additional question. So those who are attending today and listening to your stories and listening to this and may have a thought, that, oh my gosh, I wish that I could find other parents to communicate with, or golly, I do really feel alone. How should they reach out? What are your next steps to increase the visibility of this programming?
Well, our plans to continue building. So next year, we're already adding Medical Lake and College Place school districts. Again, these are school districts that have demonstrated that they have an interest in really partnering with communities and families so that these presentations can be maximally successful. Like, we want these to be sold out events, and they were in Richland. Think about that. 2 hours of a parent education night sold out. And that's because the districts have been working in such close partnership. And there's also just a natural way to kind of to hand off, our parents. Oh, now I want to just be clear that these parents are also wanting to be sources of ongoing support, which is something we're working on and building into this, but trying to think about a way to do that in a sustainable manner. I also want to point out that Ted is a profound leader. He has a day job, right? Like, he's a salesperson, right? Like, and he does this work out of passion and love, and he's had a tremendous impact already, and he's planning to, basically quit his day job and run this nonprofit. So I'm like, hats off to you, my friend. You are amazing. And I just, again, we would not have found any of these amazing individuals who really want to be champions in their community for change, not just around firearm storage, but around their children's mental health. We would not have found them without this grant. So we're really grateful to you. And we hope that in the future, you might be interested in learning more about what we're doing as we expand and grow.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Dr. Stuber and Mr. Robbins, for the energy and the hope created through the important prevention project that you shared with us today. So, in closing, as you've heard, the research funded by the Grandmothers Against Gun Violence Foundation and others informs new educational and policy approaches to reduce gun violence and related physical and emotional harm. To continue to make a difference in the field of gun violence research and to support the development of emerging researchers, the Foundation is committed to funding new research regarding the variables impacting gun violence in our communities. This work cannot be done without your continued support of our donors and scientists dedicated to expanding our understanding of gun violence epidemic and its negative impact on families and children. So finally, a special appreciation to today's presenters, Dr. Ellyson, Dr. Rowhani-Rahbar, Dr. Stuber, and Mr. Robbins, and to you, the participants who understand the importance of standing up, speaking up, and showing up, and who will continue to stay in touch with us through our website, www.foundationgrandmothersagainstgunviolence.org, because that is the way we will continue our building community knowledge and community support for the very important work that the presenters shared with us today. So again, thank you for joining us this morning, and I hope you have a wonderful day.